that every mobile phone is either off or on silent. If you do desperately need to have a conversation, please take it outside out of respect to our authors and our panel. Without further ado, I would love to invite our esteemed panel to the stage. We have 7 people joining us. We have one very kind translator. So if I could, without further ado, please invite our moderator, Jonathan Chenin, and then we have Mr. Taha Beljanoun, who will be translated by Anne Solange. We have Selma Dabach. Joining us, we have Reza Aslan and Adaf Suef. Yes, and William Dalrymple will be introducing. And just so that you know, both Reza and Adaf have another panel directly after this, but they will be able to do just a few minutes of book signing. So we're going to get our whole panel over to the author's book signing desk afterwards. Please don't come to the stage, go straight over there and we'll usher them straight over so you get a chance to talk to them. So I'd now like to introduce, because this event is actually sponsored by the Edinburgh International Book Festival and the British Council, I would like to ask Charlie Walker to introduce the panel.
Thanks very much. I'm not going to introduce the panel. That's my friend William will do that. But I did want to just say good morning and welcome, and something about the Edinburgh World Writers' Conference. Half a century ago, Edinburgh hosted the first World Writers' Conference, and it was an incredibly influential event. It was attended by Norman Mailer, Rosamund Lehman, William Burroughs, among others, and India was represented by Khushwant Singh. 50 years later, in August 2012, the British Council and the Edinburgh International Book Festival convened another Edinburgh World Writers' Conference. And Adaf Suef was the presenter of the keynote address there, Should Literature Be Political? A number of themes have been drawn from this conference that will now travel around the world. 2 themes have been taken up here in Jaipur, and those are today's theme, a national literature, and censorship today, which was taken up, I think, in the session on Saturday. Apart from Jaipur, the themes of the Edinburgh World Writers' Conference will travel to Cape Town, Berlin, Cairo, Toronto, Istanbul, Krasnoyarsk, Kuala Lumpur, Beijing, Port of Spain, New York, St. Malo, and Melbourne. And in 2013, there'll be another Edinburgh Writers' Conference in August in Edinburgh to bring together the learning from these events, and that will be followed by publication. So the British Council is delighted to work with the Jaipur Literature Festival and the Edinburgh International Book Festival to bring these events to Jaipur. And without further ado, then I'll hand over to William Dalrymple to introduce the panel. Thank you.
You're getting 2 introductions today and 7 panelists. You're getting your money's worth. At Jaipur, we've always made a great point of trying to concentrate on regions outside the Anglophone world. And my colleague Namita, as you know, is passionate about the non-English literature of this country. But I think this is the first time we've really managed to gather a single panel with such distinguished writers in Arabic. We've had Adaf before, but we're extremely proud to bring Taha Beljanoun. I think one of the things that we have also failed in over the years is having enough Francophone literature, so Taha ticks 2 important boxes for us. Taha Beljanoun is one of France's most celebrated writers. His first novel, Haruda, was published in 1973. Since then, he's written numerous novels, short stories, poetry, and essays. He's best known for his trilogy, The Sand Child, The Sacred Night, and The Wrong Night. Adaf Suef, who runs one of the world's most brave and wonderful literature festivals, the Palestine Lit Fest, that takes writers into Gaza and across the West Bank, and does amazing work in Ramallah with the university, and has had its events broken up by Israelis year after year and still carries on. As well as doing that, she's also the Booker shortlisted author of The Map of Love, which has been translated into 30 languages. And her most recent books are Cairo, My City, Our Revolution, and Reflections on Islamic Art, in which we had a nice jaunt to that lovely museum in Qatar together. Selma Dabach, British Palestinian writer based in London. First novel Out of It, been listed for the Guardian Book of the Year in 2011 and 12. Her short stories have appeared in anthologies published in Grant, International Pen, and British Council. She was the 2005 English Pen nominee for David T.K. Wong Short Story Award. She's currently working on her second novel about expatriate living. Reza, who doesn't seem to be on this list, but I have to... Reza is a general hero, and anyone that went to his last session in the Baitak will know what a treat you're all in for. We last came across each other when he gave us an astonishing keynote session in Sydney Opera House at the last Sydney Writers' Festival and got one of the great sort of standing ovations of literary history. So you're in for a treat with him. Jonathan Shainin, you all know, is the esteemed editor of Caravan magazine and the man that has been a kind of shot in the arm for literary long-form journalism in this country. And Anne, my thing open. Anne Solange-Nobel is joining us from Gallimard and is going to do wonderful translation for Tahar. I don't think Tahar really needs it, judging by the wonderful English he's been speaking so far. Anyway, welcome them all, please. Maps of Love and Hate, Nationalism and Arab Literature.
Hello, everyone. Am I on here? Are you sure? Yes, there we are. All right. It's quite an honor to be here with this stage full of luminaries. And I thought the best thing to do might be to start in a very broad place and to play a bit with the geographical categorization that has been assigned to our panel, and to just ask a very broad question about is it reasonable to speak of a single Arab literature or to speak of an Arab literature in English in the way that, for example, we speak of Indian writing in English here, and maybe to add to that question, to what extent is this notion of an Arab literature perhaps a category imposed from the outside in a way where, you know, among Western publishers, one might see a kind of Arab literature as a kind of category in a bookshelf, in a store, I mean. So Adaf, let me start with you. We talked about this a little bit before. What do you think of when you think of an Arab literature or of multiple Arab literatures?
Yeah, I think of Arab literature, as in... actually, I should first start by thanking the British Council, because
I should have done the same.
Yeah, because it's under their auspices that I'm here. I was actually told that when I came here this year, all I would have to do is re-speak the talk I gave in Edinburgh about should literature be political. And of course, now that I'm here, it's all completely different. But that's fine. We will deal with that. No, it's wonderful to be here. It's amazing to be back in Jaipur. I think it's the best, the nicest literary festival there is. It's terrific, really. So thank you, Jaipur. I think, no, it's not at all a notion inflicted from outside. There is an Arab literature. There is a literature that has been written in Arabic from pre-Islamic times. It was poetry then, of course, and now it's everything, poetry, fiction, essay, and I think that the key thing that makes it possible to speak of an Arab literature is that it's a literature that is aware of itself as an Arab literature. In other words, a poet working in Arabic today in Egypt is aware of the poetry that is being and has been written in Iraq, in Palestine, in Morocco, across 14 centuries, really. And you know, is adding to that body of work, is responding to it, and so on. So there's very, very much an Arab literature that is conscious of itself as such. And I think it's interesting, all of us are people who write Arabic literature in a different language. And I think it's interesting that we are, well, not Reza, sorry, but he's close enough to be encompassed in this. And I think we're writers of fiction. I think poetry is a completely different ballgame, really. But fiction itself has, of course, Arabic fiction has been completely influenced, if not born of, Western literary fiction. I mean, everybody accepts and admits that the novel as an art form in Arabic was born of being exposed to the novel as an art form in English and French and Russian and so on. And so the fact that here we are, Arab authors who are writing in different languages as well, I think can almost be seen as a natural extension, if you like, of Arabic fiction.
I wanted to go to Reza here. So William did not mention this in the introduction, I don't think, but Reza has edited an anthology called Tablet and Pen. I believe the subtitle is Literary Landscapes from the Middle East or of the Middle East?
Of the Middle East, yes.
And you've defined this rather broadly, I think. Manta, we said, is one person who is included, who will be familiar to everyone in the audience here, also Chuktai. As you were sitting, well, let me ask you before we go further with this, What was the motivation for putting together an anthology like this? This came out in 2010, I think.
Yeah, 2011, yeah.
2011. What was the motivation, and what was sort of guiding you both aesthetically as you were looking at these texts, but then also, I think, politically in terms of what you hoped, or maybe you didn't have this way of thinking about it, what you thought this might achieve in terms of exposing readers in the West to this writing?
Right. Well, first of all, let me begin by saying that there's no surer way to start a fight than to call an Iranian an Arab. No, just kidding. Just kidding.
I backed up.
Well, so I do admit that the subtitle is kind of problematic. That's how subtitles are sometimes, and often writers don't have that much choice in the way that those things are created by editors and publishers. But the anthology is literature of the last 100 years translated from Turkish, Persian, Arabic, and Urdu, many for the first time. And those four languages are languages that are profoundly uncovered in Western literature. I mean, these are some of the titans of global literature. You've mentioned two of them. And Westerners are simply unaware of this incredible literary tradition. When they look at this region of the world, West, Central, South Asia, they see it almost wholly through the lens of either religion or politics, as though those are the only things that matter to the people of this region. And when in reality, the thing that is, I think, most animating in these cultures is the arts, literature, architecture. I mean, this is what gave birth. I mean, this is truly the cradle of storytelling in many ways. And so, the first thing that I wanted to do was introduce Western readers of English, to this great body of literature. But I had a second agenda, which was that the literature is from 1910 to 2010, and it's put together in such a way as to read almost as though it's a single narrative. I mean, that was my goal. That most anthologies are, you pick it up and you just sort of read a little bit here and a little bit there, but I wanted something that you read from the first page to the last, and you felt as though you read a single sustained story about this region, about the last 100 years of this region. And in a way, I think of it as almost a new kind of a history book, one that's not written by Westerners or outsiders or academics or colonialists, but one that's written by the artists, the poets, the writers of the region. It's in their words. So that was my primary motivation.
Do you think one runs the risk of sort of imposing a continuity on this body of work, or do you think that in fact you're unveiling or uncovering this idea that work in these different languages, which might have been perceived to be separate from one another, should indeed be seen as part of a sort of continuum?
It's such a wonderful question, and that is a real difficulty that any editor has. And so what I wanted to do was I compiled thousands and thousands of poems and stories from these four languages during this 100 years. And then I just spent months just reading it and reading it. And I really wanted to make sure that master narrative that I was talking about came out in a natural way. Now, it is true that once I saw that line, that narrative, pieces that I liked but that didn't fit that narrative, I removed from the book just to maintain sort of the overall feel of it. But I like to think that I did as good a job as can be done by any editor to stay out of it as much as possible. And that master narrative, by the way, is a very interesting one to this panel, because what I discovered was that what we understand about this region, the very concept of nationalism, the idea of the nation state as not just a factor of your identity, but the supreme factor of your identity, which after all is the definition of nationalism as we understand it in the 20th century view of it, was shaped not by politicians, but by writers. It was the poets and the writers who gave birth to Arab identity as we know it, who gave birth to the modern Middle East. It was Turkish writers who defined what the modern state of Turkey actually means against both the Ottoman hegemony and against Western colonialism. It was the writers and the poets who defined what the nation state means, and then very quickly those same writers and poets became the enemy of the nation state. And the best example of it, Tablet and Pen, of course, is the title of a famous poem by Faiz Ahmed Faiz, who wrote in Urdu and whose writings really kind of fashioned a clear Pakistani identity, really became the voice for the birth of Pakistan until Pakistan became a reality, and then was immediately imprisoned and became the primary social critic of that state.
Let me go to Selma here. I wanted to go back to you with a version of the same question that I put to Adaf at the beginning, which is about this question of sort of categorization. And you had said when we were speaking earlier that you wondered if maybe this was becoming a slightly obsolete way to think about literature as kind of divided into sort of regional categories.
Well, yeah, I think because I'm so hybrid, I tend to, every time I get snug in a particular category that I move towards, I inevitably come across the purists who'll kind of kick me out of it. So I mean, with some of the definitions of Arabic literature, I just wouldn't fit in at all. And it's quite interesting if you're sort of a mixed identity and you're writing, you've got a British passport and you're writing in English, but you choose a subject matter which is Arab-based, then you can get put into the Arab category. Whereas with some writers, like, for example, Kazuo Ishiguro, who writes about very British subject matter, would be considered as a very British writer. So sometimes it seems to, the fault line seems to depend on what you're writing about and what you're concerned with. I mean, I sometimes think it's more, the way that I read literature is not so often now in terms of looking at the country people are from, but the themes they're dealing with. And particularly when I was, wanting to look for inspiration when I was writing my novel, these issues about how politics is written about in a literary form, I was looking more at South America than perhaps Arab writers as a source of influence, and looking at uses of the absurd. So it was more of a kind of thematic way of looking at other literatures, And I think it would be quite refreshing if sometimes literature was looked at like, how do these writers deal with the family, across the board, rather than just saying, how do, Arabs, as though having some Arab blood or an Arab name or whatever is going to be your main motivator in how you look at the family. It's not so different wherever you are.
So let me ask you another question, though, because, your first novel out of it...
Sorry. It's my alarm. Put it on silent.
Time to wake up.
I'll take this moment to remind everyone in the audience, if your cell phones are still on, to turn them off.
Do not follow my example.
Yeah. And I'm just relieved it wasn't me.
Yes.
No, so, you've written a novel, your first novel, which is set in Gaza, and which is, very much about the tribulations of a single family. And you talked a bit about the, dilemma is maybe not quite the right word, but about the situation of writing about something from the outside of it, and yet reading the book, it doesn't read as if it's a book that's written from the outside of where it takes place.
Yeah, I mean, I had been to Gaza before I wrote the book, but I'd been there in the late 90s, and it was a brief visit, and it was a very kind of cursory impressions that I got when I went there. And then I was away from Gaza for about 10 years while I started writing this novel. And actually, when I decided that I wanted to write a novel, I didn't really have a place particularly in mind. I had an image, I had a feeling of frustration. It could have been Iraq, it could have been south of Lebanon, and I wanted to keep it very abstract. And I actually wanted to, I'd read a Boliano short story I was kind of influenced by, and I thought, okay, what if I just give them X's and Y's as names to free people up from all these negative associations which come with being Arab. And I tried it as a short story, and it kind of worked, and it was a bit exciting, but I didn't feel I could follow it through as a novel, but it was what I wanted to write as a novel. And then I decided the place where I wanted to set it was Gaza, but I couldn't actually go to Gaza at that time. So I wrote a fictional Gaza. I fictionalized it. I based it on blogs, research, outside sources. And I was kind of, there are writers like Kafka's America was written without going to America. I think Barbara Kingsolver hadn't been to the Congo for a long time when she wrote Poisonwood Bible. There are possibilities of writing from the outside. And I was quite... So, and in any fiction writer, it is the question of being an imagined place that you're creating. It's your impression of it. So I wrote this novel. And then the novel was actually out by the time I went back to Gaza. And some of the things which had happened in my novel had not happened when I wrote the novel. I had a bombardment of a hospital and a school, which actually had happened more in Jenin, but not Gaza when I was writing. By the time I'd gone, all these things had happened. You know, there was this horrible, kind of sickening prophetic feeling about the book, and it's now sometimes being called the caste-led novel, which is also sort of ironic. But when I went back there, it was this very unusual feeling to see a country that you've created in your mind in reality, and to see whether or not you've got it right. And most of the time I think I did, but occasionally I thought my tonality was a little bit off. Maybe sometimes I talk to one particularly inspirational person and think, right, I've got it, I've got it too dark. My novel's just too dark, and then I'd hear something else and I'd think it was too light. But it was a particular experience about writing from the outside.
Well, I think this question of writing from the outside is an interesting one, and I will come to Tahar now. As we sat to prepare, or as I sat at least to prepare for this panel, I tried to think about, what are some themes and what are some threads that, might be seen to run through the Arab experience, might be seen to, be common to, Arab writers of the last several generations, and what are things that come up frequently in these books. And one thing that struck me as a theme that one often saw was this question of crossing borders, of mingling of cultures, and of, look at a book like Tayeb Salah's Season of Migration to the North, which is really about someone who goes to the West and then comes back and his experience of Sudan upon returning. So for Tahar to ask him about this position of writing from the outside, to have sort of one foot in Morocco and one foot in France, and kind of how that structures your thinking about the fiction you're writing.
Oui, d'abord, on écrit toujours de l'extérieur.
You always write from the exterior.
C'est comme une abeille qui va tomber dans un pot de miel, elle ne va pas travailler.
A fly who falls into cup of honey will not be able to
Elle a besoin de partir.
The bee will need to fly away to be able to work.
Et l'écrivain est toujours en exil, même chez lui.
And the writer is always in exile, even when he lives at home.
Alors, je voulais juste préciser une chose, pourquoi la tradition littéraire arabe est avant tout poétique.
I wanted to explain why the Arab tradition is before all poetic.
Pourquoi les Arabes sont arrivés au roman récemment seulement, c'est-à-dire il y a un siècle.
Why did the Arabs arrive to Arab writers actually arrived to novels recently, within the last century?
Le premier roman arabe qui a été publié, ça a été publié en feuilleton au Caire. Il s'appelle Zainab.
Zainab, the first Arab novel published in Egypt
en 1912.
in 1912.
Parce que tout simplement, la société arabe ne reconnaît pas l'individu.
Because the Arab society did not recognize the individual.
Et quand on ne reconnaît pas l'individu, on ne reconnaît que le clan ou la tribu.
So you recognize the clan or the tribe.
On ne peut pas mettre en avant un individu comme personnage pour faire du roman.
So it's very difficult to put forward one character of a novel as an individual.
Ce qui explique aussi la condition de la femme dans tous les pays arabes et musulmans a toujours... Oui.
Which also explains the condition of women in the Arab and Muslim world.
A été victime de cette façon de ne pas reconnaître l'individu, de ne pas émerger l'individu.
So the women were also the victims of a society which would not permit the individual to be recognized.
Alors quand on me pose la question, est-ce que tu es un écrivain arabe ou un écrivain français, je leur dis ce sont des questions que me posent les gendarmes ou la police des frontières.
When people ask me if I'm an Arab writer or a French writer, actually it's when I cross customs and they ask me if I'm Arab or French.
Si je dis je suis écrivain français, les Arabes vont me dire tu es un traître.
If I say I'm a French author, the Arabs are going to say you traitor.
Si je dis aux Français je suis un écrivain arabe, je dis tu n'es pas reconnaissant.
If I say I'm an Arab writer, they're going to say how ungrateful.
Donc on est dans une situation terrible. Alors moi je préfère La définition, ma patrie, c'est la langue.
So that's a terrible dilemma, and I prefer to answer, my homeland is my language.
En même temps, on a le droit d'avoir plusieurs patries.
And you're allowed to have several homelands.
Moi, j'aimerais bien être indien.
I would love to be Indian.
Oui, pourquoi pas. Un jour, on m'a posé la question, c'était sur le roman, j'ai fait une communication, je dis, je suis un écrivain japonais.
One day I was in an event and I said, you know what, I'm a Japanese writer.
Et quelqu'un, c'est vrai parce que Murakami, on lui a dit, est-ce que vous êtes japonais? Il a dit, j'aime le sushi.
Murakami once was asked, about being Japanese, and he said, well, I love sushi.
C'est tout. Alors, moi, je suis marocain, je suis arabe, j'aime bien le couscous, mais enfin, c'est pas suffisant.
I love couscous.
Bon,
That's
donc,
not enough.
cette question d'identité, moi, je suis un écrivain réellement japonais. Ça se voit pas, mais j'ai pas les idées ridées, mais je suis japonais.
If you ask me in terms of identity, I don't have slanted eyes, but I'm a Japanese author.
Et je vous jure, quand je lis les écrivains japonais, eh bien, je me reconnais dedans.
I recognize myself in Japanese novels, which I...
Comme ça, le problème est résolu. Je ne suis pas arabe, je ne suis pas français, je suis japonais, c'est tranquille
Okay,
là.
we've solved the problem. I'm not Arab, not French, Japanese.
Alors, j'ai trouvé une patrie idéale, d'autant plus que les Japonais, comme les Indiens, sont des gens très bien.
Isn't that wonderful? Japanese are just as wonderful as Indians, so I've found my homeland.
Alors, une fois que cette question est résolue,
Said.
oui, maintenant, plus de questions sur l'identité.
So no more questions on identity.
Alors, nous avons le droit d'écrire sur tout,
We're allowed to write on everything,
et pas uniquement sur l'exil ou l'immigration.
and not only on exile or immigration.
On a le droit d'écrire aussi sur le bonheur et le malheur,
We can write on the happiness. We can write
sur le mariage et le divorce.
on marriage, on divorce,
Ce sont des choses qui nous concernent aussi.
which concern us
On-
too.
Pourquoi un écrivain arabe ne va parler que des problèmes du monde arabe qui sont énormes?
Why should an Arab writer only write on Arab problems? They're enormous.
Alors, je parle des choses qui me touchent et qui touchent aussi le public.
I write on what touches me
alors,
and therefore touches you.
Il faut dire une chose, c'est que d'abord, il faut faire un peu de politique.
Let's do it.
Un peu, pas beaucoup. Le monde arabe n'existe pas. Hein.
The Arab world doesn't exist.
Il y a 21 États
There are 21 countries.
qui ne sont pas unis du tout.
They're not at all unified.
Ils sont tous en bagarre les uns avec les autres.
They're all fighting against one another.
Donc, mais ils ont en commun une langue,
But they have in common one thing, which is the language,
la langue arabe classique,
classical Arabic,
que le peuple ne parle pas.
which the normal people don't speak.
Alors,
Classical Arabic.
vous imaginez, tout le monde parle une arabe classique, que le peuple ne comprend rien.
The normal people can't understand.
Alors, nous avons en commun une langue arabe,
So we have a common language,
mais qui est réservée à une élite.
reserved to the happy few, to the elite, to the cultured people.
Let me come in here for 1 second. I want to go to Adaf here with something that Tahar you said at the beginning, which was this idea of Arab culture thinking. I may be misquoting you here. Less in terms of the individual and more in terms of the collective. And I'm curious about, what some of these sort of threads that we see as kind of common themes in Arab literature, not in all of it, of course. But Adaf, one of these that strikes me is this idea of a tension between the individual and the collective. And whether you think, A, this is a subject that has often been of interest to Arab writers, and B, whether you think Tahar is right, actually, that there is a sort of preference or a precedence given to the collective rather than to the individual in Arab culture.
I don't really see why one needs to make such sweeping generalizations. I mean, I don't trust big general statements about a culture or a people. I think Tahir bin Jaloun has expressed something really important when he said that he feels an empathy with a Japanese novel. I mean, certainly what literature at its very best does is that it enables you to live experiences that you have never lived, and to feel empathy with characters and friendship with characters that you would never in real life meet. And that is why, I guess, literature is, in a sense, a force for the good, because it, through living in a novel or a story, you kind of recognize your common humanity with the people of a different culture, and so that really is what I think that literature does. Now, whether there are overarching themes in literature that is written in Arabic, I think the overarching themes in general come from what sort of people are experiencing. And so in the Arab world, one of the great common experiences is the experience of colonialism, for example, and of the fight for liberation, and of what form that fight would take, and of the different answers to that question. And so therefore that is a major theme in the Arab novel.
Right.
And so start looking at the novels of the 80s and the 90s, and you'll find novels that deal with the social issues of the day in the various countries, and with what direction society wants to go in. And
Right.
of course there are the novels about women and women's liberation, and they're, I mean, so it's not very useful, I think, to try and isolate themes and say that they are particular to Arab writing. I mean, take a novel like George Eliot's Middlemarch. Now that could be an Arab novel in the sense of the themes that it deals with,
Right.
or The Mill on the Floss. It's just the local details that are different. But the issue of finding a voice and finding a place in the world and realizing your ambitions and so on, that's a theme for novels everywhere.
Selma, do you want to come in on this question?
No, I'd really concur with that. I mean, in terms of the universality of themes and the ability of the novel. I mean, what you're really trying to do, you're trying to communicate a reality which no other form, I think, is able to do so effectively, because there's such a direct relationship between the writer and the reader, which other art mediums don't really give you. Normally there are other people intervening in that image or presenting pictures, but you're actually building on the mental associations that the reader has, and that they can just build on the basis of words, which is quite special. And I think it allows people to move into the other person's skin and to walk around in their reality like no other form does. And I think particularly when you've got a region of the world like the Arab world, which is so sort of misunderstood and misrepresented, that this does throw up issues when you know that your book, if you're writing in a language, if you know that you're like English, when you know your book's going to be read by the outside, there is what can develop in the Anglophone Arab literature is a sort of a consciousness, an awareness of readership, which one shouldn't have, but does have, and has to be conscious of the fact that you have.
I mean, is this a burden that look, the writer in every culture faces this burden of, if we look at the novel as, I think, essentially a humanist project, and in many ways as sort of an individualist project, or something that is about kind of describing with integrity and authenticity the lives of individuals, it seems to me a contradiction to then at the same time ask these novels to bear the burden of representing an entire culture. And yet, I think it cannot be denied that when we live in a moment where kind of stereotypes and abstractions and generalizations about the Arab world abound, that some of these works of literature, though they don't take this as their mandate, can serve as a kind of corrective to some of these cliches, to some of these stereotypes. Reza, I want to ask you about this in terms of what you were thinking. This anthology that you've produced strikes me as being very much of a political moment, which is the sort of post 9/11, America obsessed with Islam as this new threatening other.
I mean, I think you put your finger on something, because the job of the writer is to tell stories, and nothing gets in the way of a story more than idea or agenda or trying to kind of wrap yourself around these big themes. I mean, I teach writing at the University of California, and And I'm always constantly trying to hammer into my students' heads that stories are about people, not about events. They're about people, not about ideas. But unfortunately, I think you're right, when you are sort of burdened with this responsibility that often comes from the expectations of the reader, not so much from any kind of inherent attempt by the writer to be representative of a people or a culture or a religion or an ethnicity. It can be absolute poison to the creative process. But I think, again, that also speaks to the magic of storytelling. You're right. I had a distinct agenda in mind in putting in this anthology together, but I think that agenda has to do with this fundamental fact that the only thing that's out there with the power to break through the walls that separate us into different nationalities, different peoples, different cultures, different religions, is story. Story has the ability, because it is ultimately, as we've been saying, about the human condition, to just break through those walls and to reach us in a very visceral, intimate way, that it doesn't matter what God we pray to or what state we're a citizen of. And I think that's what I wanted to emphasize, is that these are ultimately stories that are about human beings, regardless of where they're from or how they live.
Let me ask Tahar about this, actually, about this, defending the integrity of the art and the story against this sort of easy way of kind of, taking it to represent an entire nation or taking it to represent, an entire religion or a region that spans, a third of the world.
Oui, on ne représente que soi-même.
You only represent yourself.
Et encore. Et alors, mais ce qui est bien avec les écrivains dans le monde arabe, c'est que nous sommes pris au sérieux.
We're taken seriously. That's a good thing about as Arab authors.
On est pris au sérieux par les lecteurs
But we're taken seriously by the
et
reader.
aussi par la police.
And also by the police, by the way.
Alors, ils lisent, ils font semblant de lire. Et,
La police ou les...
ou la police.
And the policemen, they pretend that they read.
Et alors, on est souvent, on écrit, mais on pense qu'il y a un certain nombre de choses qu'il ne faut pas dire.
So we write
Alors,
and we